Hello, everybody. Good evening to any viewers out there in Britain and Ireland. If you're elsewhere in the world, good morning, good night, good afternoon, good day, wherever you are. So, my name is Lucas Norton from the JORVIK Viking Centre. You might know me as one of the hosts of that JORVIK Viking Thing podcast. And I'm here today for a conversation all about the Vikings in Ireland. I'm joined by a very special guest, Matthew Lester, who is Assistant Keeper of Archaeology in the Education Department at the National Museum of Ireland Archaeology. So, hello, Matthew. How are you this evening?
Hi, Lucas. Thanks very much for having me on. Really excited to talk all things Viking Ireland and see what we can kind of learn as a comparative to Coppergate.
Excellent. Yeah, we'll look at some of the similarities and the differences on each side of the Irish Sea during the Viking Age. So, anyone viewing out there, if you've got any questions that pop into your brain as you're listening to our chat, please do put them in the chat box. We will leave some time at the end of our discussion to answer any questions that you have. So, feel free to ask away and we'll see what we can do for you. So, Matthew, if you're ready, shall I give you my first questions about Vikings in Ireland?
Please go ahead, Lucas.
Excellent. So, Irish monastic accounts, they record a huge number of Viking attacks upon Ireland at the very start of the Viking Age. So, what was it about Ireland that attracted so many Viking raids upon it?
So really good question, and I suppose the simple answer, just to start off, it is very, very similar to what we find in the Anglo-Saxon attacks and the raids stemming from Lindisfarne in 793. Similar timescale as well with Ireland. We find 795, the first, official Viking raid, shall we say, on
very
Rathlin
shortly after
Island.
Lindisfarne, then, yeah.
Very, very shortly off the
793
north.
over here.
Yeah, so just 2 years after. But to sort of put it in context, you need to kind of understand Ireland at the time. So this is really referred to as the early medieval period for Ireland. It sort of typically starts kind of 432 with the arrival of St. Patrick to Ireland. So it really is that sort of early Christianity. Now, with that arrival, of course, we get the sort of the explosion of monasticism around the country. So this period runs the whole way through from kind of 432 up till 1169 and the arrival of the Anglo-Normans. But this early medieval period sees, as I said, that sort of explosion of monasticism around the country. We start getting these centers of crafts and trade, and really sort of development of a very sort of unique Irish art style, which is sort of stemmed in the earlier Iron Age materials, and it sort of takes on then influences. Some are Anglo-Saxon, some are Germanic, and we end up essentially with incredibly beautiful and obviously highly desired high quality pieces of silver and gold work. So probably one of the nicest examples I can show you guys is from the 8th century. That's the Ardagh chalice. So this is
an image of that we can bring up now.
Yeah.
There we are. Wow.
Lovely.
Lovely.
Yeah, it really is lovely. It is one of the highlights of the National Collection Museum here in Dublin. Free to visit whenever you're in the city. Just pop on in and you can come on one of our free guided tours of the highlights of the museum as well. But the Ardagh chalice is an 8th century object. It is absolutely exquisite, as you can see, made out of silver. Really interesting story. It was found by two young boys in 1868. They were out digging for potatoes in a ring fort in or near Ardagh in County Limerick. And they're digging away down to the soil, and a clunk, they hit a large stone capstone. They remove this, and inside they not only find the Ardagh chalice, they found a small copper chalice as well, and then 4 gilt silver 9th century Viking brooches.
Wow.
So it's sort of these objects put together are the Ardagh hoard, but that main piece really is the Ardagh chalice. And as you can see, it is exquisite. There's over 350 pieces, putting it all together. Lots of different beautiful design work put through. It's about 17.7 centimeters high, 24 centimeters in diameter, and it's in the shape of a sort of a late Roman tableware. But really just kind of wanted to show you that as an example of the quality of the silver work that is being produced in the monastery. So really, really high quality pieces. And of course, things like this, the Vikings are absolutely coming to Ireland to attack our monasteries and take these pieces. If you actually look at Scandinavia, really, really interestingly, there's over 300 items of hack silver that look like they come from Irish objects that have been taken from Ireland back to Scandinavia. So the Vikings would come take an object such as this. Very difficult, Lucas, if you and I are on a Viking ship to share this object. It might be fun to be drinking out of, but when it comes to actually using it as its wealth, the Vikings would have chopped it up into hack silver. And
Yeah,
it's these fragments that we're finding throughout.
so there may have been
So
many more examples of objects like this that are now lost to the ages. Yes.
absolutely, as I said, we know of at least 300 that are surviving in Scandinavia. These small fragments. So really, kind of objects like this, objects like the Tara brooch as well, another exquisite object that we're making at this time.
Let's have a look at that one then. Oh, it's a very different type of object, but
Very, very
just
different
as
type of object.
magnificent, isn't it? Yeah.
It really is. Again, it's another highlight of our collection. The Tara brooch, very different. Instead of being this sort of ecclesiastical object or this object used in church as part of the Christian mass that the Ardagh chalice is, this is a worn piece of personal wealth. And it's, I think you could agree, a nice statement piece. Really is quite incredible. Now, this one was found by a mother and a young son walking along a beach in Bettystown in County Meath. The mother sold it to a watchmaker in Drogheda, who sold it to a jeweler, George Waterhouse, down in Dublin. Now, around the time that this was discovered, there was a big kind of movement in Ireland, the Gaelic or the Celtic revival, really. So sort of Ireland's history was getting kind of promoted more around this period. So George Waterhouse, in a very, very cunning marketing ploy, renamed this brooch the Tara brooch to link it with the Hill of Tara and the high seat of Irish kings. So a really lovely example of an archaeological object getting a little bit of upselling. It has no association to the Hill of Tara at all, but that name has stuck with it, so we know it as the Tara brooch. But really stunning piece. Again, it's got, if you see kind of towards the sides, you can see those lovely playful animals that are crawling out of it, coming back in and biting the rim of the object. That's the sort of Germanic animal influence. We've got those Anglo-Saxon designs coming in as well. But one thing to note with this object, which is really, really beautiful, it's pseudo-penannular, but the back is as highly decorated as the front of the object. Really, really stunning piece. So it's objects like this, objects like the Ardagh chalice, objects like the Tara brooch that the Vikings are coming to Ireland for. And you can see, just looking at them, absolutely why they would have been such a valuable piece to be taken away back to Scandinavia.
Yeah, I think I recall seeing there's an object which is quite famous in Scandinavia. I believe it's a reliquary from Ireland, and someone has emptied out whatever holy objects were once inside it, probably not knowing what on earth these bits of bones were or something. And they've scratched in runes on the back of it. Ranveig owns this cask.
Yeah, so the little cask tomb that you're referring to, again, beautiful reliquaries. We have a huge number of them in Ireland. We're very lucky that we've got so many of them in the treasury at the museum. And these would have held those sacred objects either associated with the saints, or they could be corporal relics. We have a beautiful later shrine for St. Locton's arm, so it's an arm relic. We've got a St. Patrick's tooth shrine, so we have a tooth relic.
Yeah.
We've got St. Bridget's shoe, which is a shoe shrine. So some really interesting different objects and different shrines. Some of the more famous ones are probably the book shrines like the Cathach or the Battler, which was brought in to battle to really kind of help those who were carrying it to defeat their foes. But yeah, the craftsmanship that's coming out of early Christian and early medieval Ireland is exquisite. And these objects are just a high value, not only the materials they're made out of, but just that actually intrinsic beauty of them themselves.
Yeah. You made a mention of hack silver earlier. I think we might have an image of some of that here. Let's just take a look. Some hack silver, yes. So I've got bits of hack silver here. So bits like this, I suppose, may have once been lovely objects like those chalices and brooches.
Absolutely. We do find with the Vikings coming in, particularly in the 9th century, the latter half of the 9th century, we start finding this massive influx of silver coming into Ireland. So there's a huge amount coming in, and a lot of this is coming in the form of either Arabic coins or other silver items from the rest of Europe and the Near East, melted down into ingots, and then those ingots are chopped up we do find a lot of these objects. I mentioned earlier that's sort of portable wealth, being able to carry your wealth on you. And the silver armoring, a very kind of noticeable object of Viking sort of wealth as well. We'd have quite a number of these in the collection. Really simple piece. Take the object off, you chop a little bit of your armoring off, and you're using that with your merchant. It's the weight of the silver that matters. So really, Ireland doesn't get silver coinage till quite a lot later. So at this time, everything is about that sort of silver economy. It's the weight of the silver. It's how much weight of that precious material you have that matters. So hack silver armoring is really, really important for these central trading hubs that get developed by the Vikings as they settle in Ireland.
And this particular variety of armoury, and I've seen a few of these before that were found in the northwest of England. It's very much a kind of Irish Sea local culture, I think, this variety of jewellery they manufacture.
Well, I suppose the beautiful thing that you allude to there, you're saying about seeing them in, the north of England and it being local. And that's sort of one of the things that we sort of forget about the Vikings in Ireland, in the Isle of Man, in Cumbria, into northern England. There's actually so much travel back and forth that so many of these designs, so many of these artistic styles are ways of using their materials and their wealth. They are local, but they're geographically quite distant.
Yes.
Which is really, really interesting, because quite often we'll sit back and we'll look, at our own countries. We'll study Ireland in its little bubble, or the UK in its bubble. But actually, if we look at those trading movements, that localization is actually a little bit more widespread, which is really, really interesting. But definitely a really popular thing for the Viking period.
In the modern period, we tend to view the sea in particular as a barrier, a border that separates nations. But for the Vikings, it's like their motorway, effectively, isn't it? Connecting them together, allowing objects, people, and art styles to kind of spread. Now, along with treasure, I suppose the Vikings are also coming for other goods, which maybe have either been consumed or biodegraded. But were they also coming for the people as well in Ireland?
They were, absolutely. We do have a number of slave chains and collars within our collection that have been found in Viking sites. I think what's sort of important to note here is that the concept of slavery and the exchange of individuals isn't something that is brought over by the Vikings. It's just part of the world at that time.
Yeah, it's an institution across all of early medieval Europe, isn't it?
It really, really is. And that exchange isn't one way. We've got multiple recordings in the annals of Vikings being captured by the Irish and put into slaves as Ireland. So the word thrall we have today comes from that Viking word. So it is the exchange of people as a commodity, as a resource, unfortunately, is something that is, or was, should I say, very, very common across that period.
And it's something that it's an aspect of life that doesn't really show up that often in the archaeology, does it? We know, for instance, that in England in this period, slaves made up a huge proportion of the population. The Domesday Book, I think, tells us that about 10% of England's population was enslaved at the end of the Viking Age, across both Viking and Anglo-Saxon areas. But it's objects like this, the chain and the collar here, that really kind of bring it to life.
I suppose when we look at
horror of aspects of life in that period.
Absolutely. I think we look at archaeology as the study of people, and we study that through the objects that are left behind. But if you are a thrall, if you are a slave, and you have no objects, you have no personal wealth, you don't have your own home, you don't have any of your own possessions to leave behind for archaeologists to find in the future. They're a silent witness of the past in many ways, and it's only through objects like this sort of incredibly oppressive reminder, really, that we can see them. So quite rarely will we have really good tangible evidence for those individuals, which is kind of a sad truth about the world, unfortunately.
Yeah. And unlike some other people in the period, like the Anglo-Saxons, the Irish, who were having local wars, raiding and enslaving their neighbours, the Vikings, of course, have an international trade network, and they are exporting captured people over enormous distances. I believe there's been genetic studies on modern people in Iceland, and a huge proportion of Icelandic DNA seems to come from both Ireland and the north of Scotland. There's a very large, what you might call Celtic influence upon the kind of genetic history of these Viking colonies.
Yeah, it's a very very kind of real part about the that sort of movement. What's quite interesting with that is we do actually have a record, an analytic record of the daughter of a king being taken as a slave. Now she's sold multiple times by the Vikings, ultimately ends up in Iceland. And she gets given out to by her owner's wife, and her response is to give her a bloody nose. And somehow she manages to survive. This story kind of gets perpetuated, but we do know both from analytic and, as you say, genetic analysis that there is this vast movement of people across Europe.
Hmm. So there's this early period of raiding, taking all sorts of things, including enslaved people. And we are back, so apologies everybody. I think we had some trolls and Draugr in the Wi-Fi just then, which severed our connection, but we are back on Vikings in Ireland. So the question I had just asked before that break we had was, so after the initial period of the Vikings raiding Ireland, they began to establish settlements there. But what were these Viking settlements like in Ireland? And what do we think daily life was like within them?
So really, really interesting, Lucas. We, as I mentioned earlier, we've got that first sort of raid happening 795. There's different sort of ebbs and flows as that sort of activity intensifies around the coast of Ireland. But the sort of key date for us here is the sort of the first establishment of the Long Fort, the very sort of typical period settlement. I'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment, but really we start finding them along the rivers and along the coast of Ireland. The first one's recorded in our annals from about 840. And then 841, we've got Linducal, and 841 as well, we've got the site at Dublin. So really, really interesting for us. Now, these long forts are essentially a D-shaped enclosure, so earthen bank, but really the best way to imagine them in your mind is that they're a D-shaped enclosure with the open side on a riverbank or at the sea, somewhere basically safe that the Vikings can bring their longships up, have them, just the heads of them beached, they're safe and protected, they can set up the camp. And what we start seeing in Ireland, as I said, from around the 840s, is the establishment of these long forts, these centres essentially where the Vikings can now overwinter in Ireland. Before, very much it's a raiding, it's a seasonal activity. So now we know that they're staying in the country, which is really, really significant for us because we start finding, in terms of our archaeology, the daily life isn't sort of the sort of sleepy winter hub you might think of people just sort of hunkering down for winter. They're actually really, really active spaces. We've got lots of evidence for blacksmithing. So we know we've got lots of ship maintenance going on, possibly boat construction happening. We've got evidence that jet and amber are being worked in a couple of our different sites. So raw materials brought in from Scandinavia or Northern England, as the case is with our jet.
Yeah, jet from Yorkshire, from Whitby, just up the road from me.
Yeah, absolutely. So we know we've got those resources coming in, and it looks like some of the fragmentary evidence that they might actually be creating objects here during that downtime. And what's really, really interesting for us when we start looking at these sites is that actually we start getting quite a sort of mixture in who we've got in them. So we're not just looking at winter camps of Viking warriors. We start finding evidence in the archaeological record of females with these ship crews. We start finding lots of different evidence for trading. And we've got some beautiful different objects coming through, like scales and weights that we get from Island Bridge. We've also got them found in Woodstown, down in County Waterford, in a number of different long forts. So these areas, or these sort of miniature settlements, they start trading with the locals as well. So it's a really, really interesting sort of development, a really kind of hub of activity.
We have some similar types of scales and weights from the Coppergate excavation here in York, and we've actually recently got some on loan from the British Museum, which have very kind of Islamic styles in them as well. So once again, the Vikings are kind of bringing in more of these foreign influences with them in these, I guess, these temporary military camps they're setting up there.
They are, yeah. And I think if you have a look at the scales and weights, that that image I think that I've shared with you, what's really interesting about that is some of the different decorations. We're looking at that being a very Irish art style. So whether these are pieces that have Irish interlace on them that are then worked onto scales and weights. But one of the fascinating things that we do find on the set from Island Bridge, for example, is we talked earlier about hack silver and that kind of trade in weight. But of course, you need to have your known weight to compare your chunks of hack silver with. And the examples that we actually have from Island Bridge, they're in a recognized scale. So the smallest one is 26.6 grams.
Mm-hmm.
The next one is double that, and then another 26.6 added on, and then another 26.6 added on. So they are your known weight measures. So if trading those lovely objects of chalices and brooches that you have chopped up, we're able to know that, of course, that weight is that certain value. So neither of us are getting cheated out of that exchange. So really, really interesting objects coming in.
I believe there are some examples from England as well, which actually have matching corresponding weights with some examples from Ireland from the same period. So that it's almost like there's a step towards a system of weights and measures there.
There really is. And I think if you look at the time period, I suppose where they're moving forward to is this sort of standardization of value. You know, we talk about the number of Arabic coins are coming in, so the understanding of coinage, minting, well capable of creating them. Now, Ireland, we start getting our first coins much later, but it is from the Viking descendants in 997 that starts happening. So that understanding of sort of a fair market for your silver is absolutely established, which is fascinating to see as early as 841. Really, really incredible.
And of course, this is roughly the same time that here in England we have the famous Great Heathen Army pops over the North Sea, doesn't it? And we see similar, though slightly different styles of winter encampments that they used in places like Repton in Derbyshire, for instance.
Yeah.
And of course, they can make use of things like old Roman fortifications in England, which will be absent on the other side of the Irish Sea. Now, I presume there's also examples of weaponry from sites like this as well.
We do. We're very lucky, I should say, in Ireland. One of the largest Viking cemeteries outside of Scandinavia is actually in Kilmainham and Island Bridge in Dublin. So any of you who know the city, essentially quite close to Phoenix Park or Dublin Zoo or the train station as a different point of reference. But a lot of development works there when the train station was getting built. Found these burial sites and a huge range of weapons coming in, and really, really fantastic high quality swords coming through as well. Really, really beautiful. And we start off quite interestingly with single edged weapons, so single bladed. And then eventually we get that development where then we've got the double bladed Viking swords, but really, really beautiful examples in the collection from those cemeteries. But it's really, really interesting in those cemeteries, as I mentioned, not only do we have that, typical object of a Viking raider, shall we say, that weapon of warfare, but we've also got beautiful domesticated objects as well. If you look at, as I said, the scales, you look at the over brooches, the beads that we have, but as well as something a bit more sort of unique or really quite different would be something like the whalebone plaque that's on display in the museum.
Yes, I love these objects. They are beautiful, aren't they? So
And
they're
they're
quite
really,
typical of Norway, I think, these styles.
well, I think that's one of the things as well to note, Lucas. I'm really glad you mentioned it. I was kind of remiss of me to not mention it myself. But when you look at that Great Heathen Army coming over into Mercia in 865 and 66 Capture of York, and the establishment of the Danelaw, because it is predominantly Danish Vikings, whereas in Ireland what we end up having is more, we do have lots of Danes and people coming through from England, but we really end up with a lot of Norwegian Vikings coming through. So it's the Norse coming down from the Hebrides, from the Shetlands, from the Orkneys, swinging down off the north coast of Scotland and into Ireland. So it's a little bit slightly different material culture, but with these people we get this beautiful whalebone plaque that you can see in front of you. This was found inside a female's grave. It's got a lovely little linen glass smoother with it as well. So a really incredible object. But I always think there's so many different levels to this object. So first and foremost, I suppose the material, we wouldn't consider using whalebone today, but for the time period, the Vikings absolutely hunting, eating whale and using the entirety of the body and the bone to make such objects.
Yeah, from Coppergate, we've got an example, or an example was found, I should say, of a sword pommel and sword guard made out of whalebone, which at first glance seems like a really bizarre choice of material, doesn't it?
It's a large animal, and it's got quite a large skeleton, so definitely utilization of resources is a massive thing for the Vikings. They're an efficient people, but I think what I really love about the whalebone plaque from Island Bridge, what could be considered an everyday object that sort of, you can't escape the ironing even 1,000 years ago, ironing your seams down, for your stitching, but even this chore, this object is beautifully decorated. You can see those lovely long serpent heads coming down, the open maw, the sharp teeth, that lovely protrusion. There's a lot of care and a lot of love has gone into what could be considered an everyday item. It's really, really kind of stunning, but a great example of that sort of mixture of people we have coming in these early settlements in the mid sort of early 840s. A really, really stunning object.
So these long forts, they're not just military encampments, they are developing into communities in many cases, some of which became very permanent, I believe, didn't they?
Some of them became very permanent. I think one of the real interesting sort of comparisons, I think, when you look at the Vikings in Ireland, you look at the Vikings in England, for example, when the Vikings come and they attack England, we've talked about the Great Heathen Army. They take over administrative centres. So they take over York, and essentially that's that administrative centre for Northumbria. They do the same taking over with East Anglia as they spread further down to the north of Mercia. They're always taking over these centralised hubs. Ireland at this time period, this early medieval period, it's divided into hundreds of small, petty kingships. So it doesn't have the same sort of ability for the Vikings to take over or defeat one regional king and have others then, bow in servitude. So it's very, very different. I think if you look at the way the Viking long forts developed, they are all coastal, are estuarine. They're at the rivers. There's very little internal colonization or conquest of the inside of Ireland. Of course, they're using the rivers as motorways. Of course, they're trading inland, and we do find these objects throughout the length and breadth of Ireland. However, they don't have the same conquest. Now, that's not to say that the impact isn't massive, and absolutely, you alluded to it. Probably one of the most significant long forts that we have in terms of that development is Dublin city itself. So Dublin, coming from the Irish Dubh Linn, is Blackpool. So this long fort is established essentially between the Liffey to the north, and then the River Poddle to the south. And there's a large pool there where the Vikings are able to bring their ships, and they set up and they establish sort of their long fort there. And I think what's really interesting about that sort of permanency and the way that these aren't just raiding camps, I think is really, really nicely sort of shown, I suppose. In 902, the Vikings essentially get driven out from Dublin. Now there's talk of, great slaughter and the ships being burned and houses being ransacked. But actually, if we look at the archaeological evidence, there is a continuity of use of that site up until the Vikings return in 917. So having that sort of focal point for trade, that focal point for exchange is really, really significant. And it's because of these long forts and those connections with the people within the country and the surrounding kind of hinterlands, we end up with Dublin, Waterford, Wexford, Limerick, all being established as these Viking cities. So really, really sort of interesting development of these main cities around the coast of Ireland. So really kind of, massive impact on the country.
So that brings me on nicely to my next question. So we have all these Viking settlements and communities being established in Ireland, particularly around coastal regions, Dublin and Waterford, etc. So what was their relationship like with the people of Ireland?
It's a really, really interesting one. And I suppose, when we look at it in terms of the annals, very, very quickly, and in the archaeological evidence, we start looking actually at a lot of work together. Very, very quickly, it becomes the Hiberno-Norse. So that is the people of Ireland, the Hibernians, and the Norse, the Norwegians. And it's that kind of amalgamation is really, really, is quite quick. It's quite interesting, not only through that exchange of slaves and people back and forth, but now we start having intermarriage. there is a lot of use of both Viking and Irish warrior groups as mercenaries for hire within both sides of society. There's a lot of exchange and trade, so it's a very sort of quite a beneficial from both sides of things relationship. But what is interesting, I suppose, is that we, as I said, we don't get that large sort of conquest and takeover. There isn't the same sort of mass scale negativity that we might see. I suppose probably one of the most interesting things when you look at the number of battles between the Irish and the Vikings throughout the early period is that actually the Vikings lose the majority of them. They're not as successful in Ireland because, as I said, it's just multiple small different kings, and they're able to defeat these Viking groups as they're moving throughout the country. So they're quite successful on that, but it doesn't mean that there isn't that massive bit of exchange. You know, we see very, very commonly the beautiful ring pin cloak fastener. If you go out onto the streets of York this week and you have a look at the Vikings, you'll find a number of them wearing these beautiful ring pins. And Irish design finds itself all over the world. The example I think you might be showing there is an 11th, 12th century ring pin found from Glendalough in County Wicklow, which is a monastic site. But, you know, these sort of things get absorbed in. We also get a couple of different sort of interesting finds, and probably one of the best places is Ballinderry, County Meath, where there's a number of real high status objects found. And one of the most intriguing is the gaming board, the Nefertafel board.
Wow, that is beautiful, that one there. So Nefertafel is, of course, that famous Viking board game, Viking chess, some people like to call it. The rules are a bit different, of course. We've got an example of a Nefertafel board from Copperfield.
They are
nowhere near as fancy as this one, though. Ours is
yeah,
oak plank with it scratched in.
Well, we have a number of oak planks as well in the gallery from different boards. Some with lovely pinholes for kind of hold or sort of pinned pieces. So the ivory or the antler pieces that you can pin into the board. But the Ballinderry board is an absolutely stunning piece. Now, where that was found is a site called a Crannog. It's a very sort of typical high status Irish site from this period. So a lot of wealthy farmers, sort of like quite small kings, would have ring forts. So essentially concentric circle, bank and ditch with the palisade fortifications. And that's where a lot of these sort of people are living in with their houses and sort of their craft centers. But a crannog is an artificial island built in a lake or sometimes in a river. So these are very much high status. The amount of effort, physical effort to go to create these sites is really, really significant. But Ballinderry, where we find that beautiful board, not only do we have that, but we have a beautiful longbow, a number of spears, but we've also got a Ulfbert sword.
An Ulfbert sword, wow.
We have an Ulfbert sword coming out of Germany with very, so the blade is obviously coming in from Germany, and then it's being adapted, and it has very much a Viking design on the pommel and hilt. The huge question that we have is, this is obviously a high status Irish site, and we don't know the answer, but are these objects traded objects? Are they, you know, gifts, you know, diplomatic gifts? Are they items of conquest that have been captured by the Irish king or whoever was living there? Or are they simply a case of, my neighbors have these beautiful objects, I really like the look of them, I'm going to get me some of them. We don't know why they're there, but it's an incredible collection of really high status Viking objects found in what is very definitely an Irish site. So it's a really interesting collection.
Yeah. So there's clearly an exchange of objects between the Irish and the Vikings, and culture as well. I imagine there's quite a bit of intermarriage as well that's probably emerging in this period. And as you mentioned, this Hiberno-Norse culture, we've got a parallel, I suppose. We have Anglo-Danish culture begins to emerge over here, Anglo-Scandinavians perhaps. So the Vikings, they're very kind of free and liberal with adopting other cultures, cultural traits, I suppose. Quite famously, they become the Normans in France. They just start riding horseback and speaking French and drinking fine wine, things like that.
Doesn't sound like too bad a life.
Yeah. So we get these different flavors of Vikings, I suppose, that emerge across different parts of the world. And there's an interplay between the Hiberno-Norse communities in Ireland and the Anglo-Danish ones in England. There are periods where the kings of Dublin become kings of York as well. And there's clearly a kind of movement of people and objects across the Irish Sea between these two different zones of Viking settlements. You showed us you mentioned those ring pings that we showed the audience just now. We have several examples of those that were found in York. So that's clearly some of this Irish influence entering Yorkshire via the funnel, the lens of the Vikings. And I believe on many of the coins that are found in the north of England, some of the names of moneyers that are striking them, they are Gaelic names that are on them. So either there are Irish people coming with the Vikings to York, or maybe these Vikings have Irish names. There are quite a few saga characters like Niall and Kjartan, and that is derived from the Irish, isn't it? So
well, we have one.
Cultures go in a blender with the Vikings.
They really, really do, and I think that's a really important thing for us to kind of touch on. We are talking about quite a long period of time, really, where you do have this Hiberno-Norse, this Anglo-Scandinavian culture, and as we mentioned previously, there's a huge amount of movement back and forth. One of the individuals that we have a very Irish name with sort of a Norse moniker, would be Domhnall Seal's Head. So his nickname is Seal's Head. So you can imagine sort of how he may have looked. But a very, very Irish first name then with that sort of beautiful sort of kenning inspired wordplay of the Norse. So absolutely massive back and forth. And with those, with those different names, with those movements, as you said, that kind of funnel of Vikings coming through, we do get some other beautiful objects coming in from sort of those Viking travels off towards the Near East. There's one incredible object in the collection that I think would have just looked absolutely stunning when it was originally worn. And there's a little silver cone. Now, absolutely beautiful piece of silver wire. Now, there's 18 of these were found in a cave north of Kilkenny. And you look at them, they really are quite stunning. It looks like a single piece of wire, but it's actually multiple wires all worked together. And there's evidence of potentially what is like a wax-like resin on the inside as a sort of a holding mold. Mm-hmm. But what's really tantalizing is that these 18, some of them are connected by a lovely little bit of silver wire. And on that silver wire is traces of what initially looked like quite unassuming fabric. Further study showed us that fabric was silk, so we know that's coming imported, but that was either dyed a bright red or purple.
Oh, fancy colors.
Fancy colors. So that massive high status, that wealth, that object itself, this beautiful silver little cones that are, so delicate with a lovely silver trim on a purple or red cloak. You can imagine how vibrant the people at the time would have looked. Really, really incredible to see that walking down the street of Dublin or anywhere in Ireland. And of course, similar in Coppergate, you've got that beautiful silken headpiece. You've got the silken little priest pouch as well. So silk is such a valuable traded item as well. So we talk about slaves and we talk about silver objects coming out of Ireland and out of the UK, but there's also a wealth of other objects sliding in, and silk would have been one of the preeminently desired materials coming in.
Yeah, so they kind of slotted in their new settlements in Ireland into this vast transcontinental trade network there, yes. I just remembered as well, mentioning that the ring-headed pins earlier, I'm sure there's one example that was found at Lonzo Meadow, the Viking settlement in North America as well. So I guess the Vikings are the first ones to bring a bit of Irish culture into America. The first Irish Americans, perhaps the Vikings.
Well, I'll let you say that. I'll leave that one to you, Lucas. But yeah, definitely we know there is one found in Newfoundland, which is quite incredible.
So that brings me on to, I guess, my final question for you. The Viking Age, of course, eventually drew to a close. In England, we traditionally say 1066 at the Battle of Stamford Bridge, though it's a bit different in different parts of the Viking world, of course. What legacy did the Vikings have upon Ireland, and what happened to the Vikings of Ireland?
So I suppose it's a interesting one. I suppose, as you say, 1066 would probably be your typical end of your Anglo-Scandinavian period in the UK. We would look at sort of the Anglo-Norman conquest in 1169 as the end of that sort of period.
Mm.
But you say there's a lot of sort of this intermingling of different communities. One of the sort of key battles in Irish history is the Battle of Clontarf in 1014. And quite often it's seen as sort of the expulsion of the Vikings from Ireland. So Brian Boru, the sort of newly crowned High King of Ireland, he's been slowly conquering the south and well, pretty much everywhere, to be honest with you, as he's sort of amalgamating his power. And Dublin and the Dublin Vikings, that city is sort of under his under his control at one stage. And there's a little bit of a rebellion. He comes up, he puts it down, he sets Sithric Silkenbeard back on the
Great
throne
name.
in Dublin. It's a good name. It's a real good name. I wonder what he was famous for. But puts him back on the seat of power for another X many years, and everything's fine. Another rebellion then. But with the Battle of Clontarf, we have this sort of giant sort of conflict, really. Not so much as in a conflict of like the Viking world in Ireland and in the native Irish in Ireland, but it's really all about the control of Dublin, the control of that trading settlement, it's control of that hub, and bringing that under sway. And essentially, in Good Friday in 1014, the two armies collide. And it is an absolute bloodletting. It is from sunrise to sunset. And eventually, the defeated, for lack of a better term, but the defeated Viking army gets cut off from their ships with the rising tide, and they get massacred. Now, in the ensuing chaos at the end, Brian Boru actually gets killed by a retreating part of that Viking establishment on the way out. So that was often seen as sort of like the end of the Viking world, but really for Ireland, there's sort of that continuation. We look at that legacy of the different towns and cities that are established. The Vikings or the Hiberno Norse sort of they stay. And what's really, really interesting for us in terms of sort of the linguistics of it, we do find Norse still being used in a lot of law tracts during the Anglo-Norman period, kind of up into the early 13th century.
Oh, that late.
So
Wow.
that late, absolutely. So they still, that they're still part of that trading world. We do find that the settlements now would kind of take a new name on. They'd be the Ostmen. So rather than them being the Hiberno Norse, they'd be the Ostmen, basically the men from the east.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's a really, really sort of interesting changeover. But I think because the people have sort of worked together and they've intermingled, intermarried, and they've traded for centuries, really. If you look at the long forts, you look at the towns and the cities as these outlets for trade, and basically huge wealth generators, there's a lot of movement between inland and those sites. So we start finding as well, like really, really interesting in terms of the legacy. Our first coins are minted in 997, the Sithric coin, really kind of beautiful example.
There's Mr. Silkbeard.
Yeah, absolutely. So really, really nice piece. But what we get as well then is we get this really nice impact on and legacy probably in the art style. So where we've kind of finding this really interesting full circle coming around, that initial conquest or raiding, should we say, and looking for items like the Ardagh Chalice, the Tara brooch that I showed you earlier. These objects get chopped up, found in Scandinavia. Now we're finding Irish objects of a religious or ecclesiastical nature taking on Viking art styles, which is very, very different. It's a very, very different world. Now, some of this is to do with Christianization, absolutely, and conversion in, but also it's just this mingling of people. As we said, we've got a number of people who have both Irish and Norse names. This sort of identity as a Dublin Viking is that sort of Hiberno Norse culture. And I think if you look at St. Patrick's Bell Shrine, you see a really, really nice example of it. So an incredible object in the treasury at the museum. It is an absolutely stunning piece. So this is this beautiful bell shrine created to house St. Patrick's Bell. So the bell inside it is the relic associated with St. Patrick, patron saint of Ireland, and then the shrine is the object on the outside. But if you look at the side panel particularly, you can see some of that lovely flowing interlace. Now,
Mm.
this is very, very similar from the filigree and that flowing intertwining animals and beasts you would have seen on the Tara brooch and the Ardagh chalice when I showed them to you earlier. What we're finding here now is an adoption of what's known as Ernez style. This is very much a Viking style, but this is seeing that sort of wider spread of those interlocking animals. It's a bit more open. It's a bit more showing more of the negative space in a way. So it's really, really interesting that we see almost this sort of full circle coming around. So yeah, it's a really sort of interesting story. The Vikings in Ireland have such a massive impact in those cities, but also don't have the same sort of conquest that we have in the UK, which is really, really different. You know, it's a very, very interesting time and a really interesting archaeological record stemming from that.
Yeah, so we've got a lot of very interesting parallels, but a lot of quite fascinating differences as well there.
Yeah, and I think one of the kind of most fascinating interests, I suppose, you know, people can argue, or you know, I've heard it said that when you look at the English language, about 1/3 of the words stem from a Scandinavian or Germanic origin. If you
Words
look
like
at the
egg.
words like egg, glitter, one of my personal
Yeah.
favorite ones. Obviously not disco glitter, but the sparkling of the ocean on a sunny day. But the real kind of interesting one is if you look at that linguistic impact on England, if you look at that linguistic impact on Ireland and native Irish Gaeilge, there's about 20 words.
Oh, wow.
So it's very, very different. There is definitely a sort of a massive linguistic change. You look through the north of England, you know, any of the settlements or areas, sorry, that would have been part of the Danelaw, they would be, you know, for example, you mentioned earlier Whitby, you know, that BY, that farm. There aren't any in Ireland. They're not name associated spaces of a similar nature. So it's quite a different, as I said, a non-conquest, but still a massive impact through sort of cultural exchange and trading.
Yeah. Wonderful. So that's been really interesting. Thanks for answering those questions that I had for you there.
You're very
I'm
welcome.
just going to see if we've had any questions that have come in from our audience at all. One of my colleagues is just going to gather those together for me. Let's just have a look. Thank you very much. So, let's see here. Oh, we have had a few coming in from the audience. Wonderful. So, first question. We don't have their name here. Are there any artifacts that demonstrate any trade between Dublin and Jorvik? Now, I've mentioned those ring-headed pins earlier. Those ones that are in our collection from Coppergate, those are very much of an Irish Hiberno-Norse style. Anything at your end that demonstrates trade with Jorvik?
Yeah, I suppose maybe not looking at trade as much, but almost a shared kind of material culture. I suppose one of the objects that I remember loving seeing when I was at Jorvik was, of course, those beautiful cattle bone ice skates.
Oh, yes.
Absolute crowd pleaser, absolutely fantastic. Remember the first time I saw them thinking, oh, Vikings ice skating, this is nonsense. But, you know, a wonderful piece. But similarly, we have them as part of the material culture of the Vikings living in Dublin. The buzz bones, we have them as well over here. So there's a lot of those sort of objects that are very similar coming back and forth. The ring-headed pin is possibly our best example, where we have that. I suppose another place you could look at that trade, or York potentially as a stepping stone, is little jet crosses.
Yeah.
We do have, I think we've got 4 in the collection now. I know one's a lot later from Glendalough, about 12th century, but we do have earlier ones, you know, part of the Viking levels coming through. So they would have had to travel through York. So that would have been York over to Dublin. So there is definitely a lot of back and forth, but probably the most emblematic would be the ring pin.
Yeah.
Really beautiful objects.
And I guess the people moving back and forth, the dynasty that I touched upon earlier, the moneyers, so the coins do give evidence of people crossing the Irish Sea, probably bringing some objects with them as well.
Yeah. I think that, you know, the sort of dynastic ruling families going back and forth. You know, I talked about the Vikings leaving Dublin in 902. They went straight to the north of England.
Yeah.
And when they come back in 917, it's because they're leaving the north of England to come back. So there's a lot of huge movement of people there as well. So absolutely trading across very clearly.
Great. So our next question from Emily is, what would the silver chalice that we showed near the beginning have been used for? So if we got an image of that back up again.
Yeah, really good question. Sorry I didn't touch on this. So the silver chalice is an ecclesiastical vessel. So it's an object used in the celebration of the Christian Mass. So this would have been held up by the priest. Now, what's interesting about this object, and you won't unfortunately be able to see it in that image, but the entirety of it is decorated. So the underneath is done, the inside is done, the rim is done beautifully. The entirety of the object is created. It was often thought before that is so that when the priest holds the chalice up during communion, that the congregation, the people in church, in Mass, would be able to see underneath and see that decoration. However, we know the priest would have actually had his back to the congregation.
Oh.
So the whole decoration is really for the glory of God. So it's that expression for this early Christian period. So yeah, it would have been used in Christian Mass in early Christian Ireland.
Interesting. So I've got a question from Aaron. How many Viking Age hoards have been found across Ireland? And he's let us know he's local to where the Galloway hoard was found.
Very good. Off the top of my head, I'm afraid I could not give you an answer. Many is the answer. There has been lots and lots, but as a specific number, I'm afraid
They vary in size so much as well, can't they?
Well, they really can. There are some really really significant. Well, they're all significant, but there are some significant weight hoards that are truly massive. Some that are lots more. It's an interesting question, I suppose, as well. If you look at what our definition of a Viking hoard would be, the Ardagh chalice and the hoard that's found in has, said 4 9th century gilt Viking style brooches. Is that a Viking hoard or is it an early Christian Ireland hoard? But no, excellent question. But I am really sorry, off the top of my head, I don't know how many. A lot. If you come to the museum on Kildare Street in Dublin, free public national museum, you can come in and you can see the wealth of silver and gold objects that we have on display. Well worth to come and have a look at.
I've got a question here from Emily. Would the Long Forts have been established in new locations, or were they replacing older settlements?
A bit of both, So it's interesting. We do have potential that some of them are coming in on earlier church sites. Island Bridge is a bit of a question because the burials there in that large cemetery, there are some Christian burials as part of that. So potentially there's an earlier enclosure ditch, which most of the early Irish churches around this period would have. They would have had very, very clearly defined banks and walls and ditches. So it would have made sense for them to come into those spaces. So there are some that definitely would have done, others that are brand new. You look at probably sites kind of similar to the way York has developed between the Foss and the Ouse, where you've got these lovely confluence of rivers. It's simple to put across one wall or one ditch and palisade and create that nice big enclosure for limited effort. So a bit of a mixture. Yeah, really good question.
A question from Brenda Throne. What do you know about the Viking warrior grave on Rathlin Island?
Yeah, it's another really, really good one. I don't know many specific details about that Viking warrior grave. There are quite a few really nice kind of similar ones around. Woods town down in Waterford is probably one of the most similar, and we do find them sort of sporadically around the country, which is really, really nice. So in sort of specifics of that one, I couldn't tell you a huge deal about it. But it does look like it's been slightly later than that, of course, that initial Rathlin raid in 795. So a little bit later, I think it's 9th century to date off the top of my head, but I would have to check that up to make sure that was correct.
Emily also asked us, what would the whalebone plaque have been used for? I believe we touched upon that a little. It's a bit like an ironing board, isn't it? The glass smoothing stone.
Yeah, the glass smoothing stone.
Smoothing of linen, I believe.
Yeah, we've got a number of the good smoothing stones in our collection from Viking Dublin. So yeah, it does look like that is essentially that early ironing board. Now, some of the arguments for it, of course, would be that such a small board, you wouldn't be doing, so say, the entire of your garment. But if you were doing any stitching at the seams, or you're trying to, work in any new embellishments, or adding in, a bit of tablet weave or ankle weave, if you're that lucky, being able to do the edges and get those kind of ironed down would be sort of the perfect thing to use it for.
Roy has asked a question about Islamic coins being brought into both Ireland and England. Were they used as coins or effectively as a very granular hack silver? So from examples I've seen, I know that some examples of the Islamic coins, they're used as jewellery and prestige items. We've got an example of a brooch on display at the moment. It's on loan to us, where they've turned a coin into a brooch for people to see. We also see necklaces in some parts of the world made out of them. And there are hacked up pieces that are occasionally found in hoards. So they may have been trading full-sized coins.
Yeah, we've got
valuable, those big coins.
They are very valuable. We've got a number of them that have come in. Woodstown again in Waterford. Bypass was being built there, and they discovered the Longford in 2003. And excavated in 2003, 2004. We do have coins from that part of the world coming in. We have them in Dublin as well. I think what's sort of key for us to remember, I suppose, for Ireland, is that early period we don't have a standardized coin, and it is really the weight of the silver. So, we talked about hack silver earlier, taking those objects and weighing them with your trader, with your merchant. It's really all about the weight. But some of them, like Lucas says, are absolutely stunning, and them getting turned into jewelry is really quite a beautiful thing.
Great. So I've just got one final question here from Brenda. Now, this does have some Irish place names in it, so I apologise if I'm about to butcher those.
That's no problem at all.
They're watching from the northwest of Ireland on the banks of the River Foyle. There's evidence of Viking raids on St. Columba's Monastery at, is it Doire? D-O-I-R-E? And a massacre of the Vikings by the Irish rulers of Inishowen. Reputed to be the largest massacre ever on Irish soil. You got any more info? I do not, but Matthew, do you?
Nothing in specifics, I'm afraid, but I think really what that, it's a really, really good point that we do have with Ireland in this time period, because of this establishment of the monasteries, this early medieval period. We do have so many annals. And as I did mention earlier, the majority of battles found with the Vikings in this period, the Vikings come out worse for wear in them. There's a couple of records of battles where 1,200 Vikings have been killed. Now, whether this is an analytic exaggeration, your guess is as good as mine without that internal propaganda. But considering how sort of laconic the writing quite often is, maybe only a small pinch of salt. But there are definitely numerous instances around the country of Ireland where these Vikings coming in, traveling overland from one Longford into another territory, are getting attacked by the Irish and getting kind of destroyed and wiped out. I think an interesting point with it is thinking about the way Irish warfare actually changes with the advent of the Vikings. Sort of the axe as a battlefield weapon is sort of unheard of in Ireland until the Vikings come in. And predominantly Irish warriors are using spears. And we've also got like lighter throwing spears, which is really, really interesting. And then another sort of kind of key indicator as to what's happening is if you look at like all of the arrowheads that have been excavated from all the different layers of Dublin throughout the years, about 90% of them are armor piercing. So really, really sort of an interesting sort of kind of martial effect with those arrows. So really sort of different sets of people happening here. And one of the reasons that really, I think, when you've got those Viking armies coming through, they're being faced by these fleet-footed people who know the landscape. They're hit and run tactics. They're in, they're out. And we do end up with a number of large massacres of the Viking raiding parties throughout the country. So there are multiple of them. The largest one, they said, I don't know off the top of my head, but it is certainly not an uncommon feature of this time period, which is really, really fascinating.
Very interesting. So that is all the questions we have time for now. It's been a very, very fascinating discussion hearing about the similarities and differences between Viking Age Ireland and England. I definitely want to make another trip over to Dublin and see all these lovely objects again for real. I'm due a trip to Ireland sometime soon, hopefully. Thank you so much, Matthew, for all the wonderful information you've given us here today. And thank you to our viewers, our listeners, hopefully around the world, who have joined us for this live stream. If you joined us partway through, we are going to put this live stream up on demand to be viewed as well if you missed the beginning of it. So once again, thank you very much, Matthew.
Thanks very much, Lucas, for having me. It's been an absolute pleasure to be involved in the JORVIK Viking Festival once again. So thank you.
You're welcome. And thank you, viewers. Goodbye, everyone.